Namaste and a very warm welcome to all the participants in today's webinar. A special welcome to our speaker, Mr. Jeff Genung from the US. Good morning to you, sir. Thank you so much for waking up early to be with us. Today's talk will be a very interesting one by Jeff on a topic that also happens to be the name of one of the organizations he has founded in the US, A Contemplative Life. The talk will be an interaction and discussion between Jeff and our program director, Shri Krishnapani K.C. Raju, and thereafter we can have some audience questions. Before we introduce our speakers today, just a little information on our company, Rtambhara Wellness. We are a collective of like-minded individuals that look at wellness in a holistic way, not just the body, but the mind as well, and all through the practice of knowledge and wisdom that comes from our ancient Indian scriptures and heritage. We are presently conducting corporate and individual programs virtually. Details of these programs are uploaded on our website, rtambharawellness.com. Do visit our website and go through the details of these programs. We also conduct every Friday webinars on topics that delve into self-discovery, personal transformation, health, harmony, and holistic well-being, as well as the arts, which help connect us with our higher selves. All our earlier talks are uploaded on YouTube under Rtambhara Wellness. If you'd like to be part of our community, please post your cell number and email ID on the chat, and we can add you to our groups. So let's get on with today's program, where Mr. Jeff Genung will be talking to Krishnapani ji on a contemplative life. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce the speakers to you today, especially our chief guest, Mr. Jeff Genung. He is the president and co-founder of Contemplative Life, a non-profit organization that connects people and communities with transformative practices, and co-founder of Transformation365.org, an experiential practice network. He serves on the board of Pro Social World as treasurer. Most recently, he launched Pro Social Spirituality, a training and research initiative exploring the integration of evolutionary science and evolutionary spirituality. Jeff has spent decades as an entrepreneur and technology executive. He has created and managed partnerships with some of the world's largest brands, including Apple, Microsoft, Walmart, IBM, SAP, HP, Dell, and dozens of other Fortune 100 companies. For decades, Jeff has studied and applied contemplative practices from around the world. He's also created many short films on practice. He's currently focused on exploring the integration of science and spirituality, the arts, and technology, with the aim of creating a more balanced and caring world for all. Very, very warm welcome to you, Jeff. A little bit about Shri Krishnapani K.C. Raju, driving the spiritual direction at Rtambhara and modernizing ancient scripture to make it contextual to today's living. Krishnapani K.C. Raju is the program director and chief faculty at Rtambhara. He's a keen student of Vedanta, Theosophy, and Jiddu Krishnamurti's teachings. So we look forward to this discussion. So over to you, Krishnapani ji.
Thank you so much, Beena ji. Without wasting much time, I would now request Jeff to initiate the program, start the program with what he perceives, and then we will take up the discussion through question and answers. Jeff, I invite you to begin your talk.
Okay. Well, thank you, first of all, for the invitation to be part of this session and this topic, which is a wonderful topic to discuss. But it's even a better topic to experience. And so I thought with a topic like contemplative life, it would be appropriate for us to maybe begin with a brief practice. And so I'd like to invite you into a practice. And it's a somatic practice and a visualization practice. So I invite you to close your eyes if you feel comfortable, or with a soft gaze if you prefer to leave them open. And just begin to just breathe naturally. And what I'd like you to do is to clench your fists, both fists. And if you're not able to do that for any particular reason, then you can just listen to the visualization, the guided meditation. But for those that are able, what I would invite you to do is clench your fists very tightly. I'm going to begin with a bell. And at the end of the bell, we'll begin to very gradually release the tension. So as we breathe naturally into our body, with each breath, we clench our fists a little bit tighter. And as you do, you can allow the breathing to serve as a buffer between the discomfort in your hands and the rest of your body. And just breathe naturally and allow the breath to soothe and to still the thoughts and the feelings and the discomfort. And as you feel this on a personal, individual level, try to touch in and feel those that are on this session right now that are also feeling this. We're feeling this together. Keeping the fists tightly clenched. We can then go beyond the circle of our individual discomfort and the discomfort that we're feeling collectively. And through this experience, begin to feel in to the discomfort all around us, within our country, throughout our world. Simply breathing and feeling. Feeling on an individual level, but feeling through on a collective level. Breathing, feeling, knowing. And shortly we'll hear a bell. When you hear that bell ring, ever so gently, ever so slowly, begin to release and relax your clenched fists. Ever so slowly, ever so gradually, just begin to easily relax. You can feel the blood begin to circulate in to the hand and the wrist and the fingers. It almost feels like we need to get reacquainted with the movement. Slowly, slowly, just opening. As if it's thawing out from a long cold. And then gradually you can begin to release our fingers and open it up, almost learning how to use it again. And then gradually, as we open up our palms, and we open up our eyes, we begin to see the mystery of life looking back at us. The idea for this practice actually came to me just shortly before we began this morning. And I was inspired by this because we're in the midst of such suffering in the world. And through the practice as a way of connecting with our own suffering and with the suffering of the world. But it's also very much related to the spiritual journey, the spiritual process, because the inner life, the contemplative life, practices that cultivate and quicken the contemplative insight are really like a thawing. It's as if the various parts of our human experience, physical, emotional, intellectual, are compressed. There's a grip. We've got a grip on it. We don't know that we have a grip on it. And it's happening on an individual level, and it's happening on a collective level. And so through intention, through receptivity, through humility, we can begin to first become aware of the grip and then begin to gradually loosen it. And as we begin to gradually loosen it on a physical level, emotional level, and intellectual level, the scales begin to fall through our eyes. And we begin to look out into a different world, a world that has been there all along, but we weren't able to see previously. So good morning, at least good morning for me. I'm in Austin, Texas.
A very good morning to you, actually, Jeff. And in the practice we just concluded, I am able to perceive a great symbolic demonstration of how we are self-limiting and self-enclosing ourselves and feeling, unconsciously tense inside. So there is this, the practice brings focus to that tension in us, and also a way to release it and connect to the environment and the whole world around us. I think that's a very insightful practice where we are made to feel both the things about how unconsciously we are enclosing ourselves and feeling that tension, and also the way to release it and connect to the whole world around us. Thank you so much. That has been a very short and wonderful practice. My first question to you, Jeff, would be, can you tell us about your personal journey towards a contemplative life, and what exactly has prompted you to in founding this organization?
Well, thank you for asking that question, because the contemplative life isn't something that I thought up. It was something that I was inspired by, and it was based on personal experience. I became interested in the inner life when I was very young. I had some experiences happen to me that gave me a frame of reference of something that was possible. But with that frame of reference also come great curiosity, because I wondered what this experience, the experience of the great mystery, was like from different streams of influence, different practices and different traditions. And so that curiosity set me down the path of spending time in monasteries and ashrams and temples and working with an indigenous elder, not so much as an academic or an observer, but as a practitioner, to be with them in kind of a humble and receptive enough way with the practices and the rites and the rituals that were being offered, to have some sense of the gift that's being delivered. And so I've always had practices in my life, and brought practices, into my family life, became an entrepreneur and brought practices into the boardroom, into the company culture. And I've worked with very young children, with teenagers, with lots of millennials that love practices, and also work with people at the end of life, hospice, people that want to die consciously. And also, served on the board of an organization called the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society, which has been a pioneer in bringing contemplative practices to higher education. And so what happened along the way is I came to the realization everyone is contemplative. Not everyone knows that, but the reason I realized that is because everyone has an inner life. It comes with the deal. But the way that we meet that inner life is very personal, and it's very diverse. And so exposure to all these different practices, I realized that when it comes to practice, there's no panacea. There's no one size fits all. What is right for one, inappropriate for one, may not be for another. And what is right and appropriate often requires discernment, individual discernment, because even good teachers and wise people can err in this way as well. And so in realizing that, but also in working with some of the pioneers of the mindfulness movement, of the contemplative movement, which tend to be older, because those that have done this deep work, it takes a long time to do this deep work. Anybody that says otherwise may not have done much of it. So they are going to tend to be older, but they're also less likely to keep pace with technology. And so consequently, they're often kind of representing their offering in kind of a web 1.0 way. And by virtue of that, not able to connect with this particularly young and growing population of people that have this great need and interest. And so they have a need that's not being fulfilled. They need help. Well, the same thing as I'm, during this period of time, I'm watching loads of young people just running out the door from organized religion. But having worked with a lot of young people, I realize it's not because they're not interested. They're actually deeply interested, but they're looking for something, and I heard over and over again, something that's authentic, meaningful, experiential, which lends itself to practice. But I also realize when it comes to practice, and particularly for young people, it's so confusing. Where do you go? What do you do? What practice is right for who? And who's qualified to teach, right? So the inspiration was that these, particularly young people, they grew up in the digital era. So they're digital natives, you might say. And so if they're going to look for something, they're going to look for something in the digital world as a solution. And so the inspiration for contemplative life was to create a hub that can kind of serve as an umbrella to bring all these different types of practices and communities of practice in one place, so that people could come to one place and navigate on their own terms to find practices of interest, and then to connect with those others of like mind. And so it was from that inspiration that Contemplative Life as a nonprofit was formed. And that's kind of the Reader's Digest version of Contemplative Life.
That's wonderful. I am able to see two important things in what you said. That you started with practice first and moved on to understand more. Generally, when somebody wants to know more about contemplative life, the way they go about is read a lot of the literature that is available and then move on to practice. But I think in your case, and it should be so in most of the cases actually, where if it would be better if one starts with the practice and practically do things and then move on to the theory part of it, or trying to know more and more as to what is communicated by the great traditions that are there. I think that's a very interesting way of movement from practice to knowing more about it from a theoretical point of view. And the wonderful thing is that you have created a forum for connecting to the young people. And as you have rightly said, the digital generation, the generation which is very comfortable and growing in an digital environment. And I think your background of technology and your academic background has also helped a lot in doing this. But could you tell me as to when this was started as an organization, and was there any event, was there any particular incident in your personal or professional life which has triggered this whole process of creating communities, bringing together so many communities to this idea or to this fundamental approach to a contemplative life, which I think is quite alien to the Western thinking process. Because the process which we see in the Western world is vigorous action. People are involved in vigorous action rather than in a contemplative life. That how is it that in your own personal journey, was there any particular event which has triggered this, and you realized that it is important to create a forum for people and communities as a whole?
Well, there's a lot in there. So I'll try to touch on a few of the things he had mentioned. In terms of, kind of an event that took the idea and moved it into something that was actionable. The idea, as I just described, incubated for a very long time. And at some point, I came to this realization that the great common ground is that we're all contemplative. We all have an inner life. And that's important to realize that we share in common. We share that in common among and between the religious traditions, and between the secular world and the spiritual and religious world. Everyone's contemplative. And so that's kind of the basis for that. And what happened is that through my experience with technology, I realized that technology could be an enabler to begin to visualize and connect these things together. And the event that took it from idea into action is that somebody that I shared some of these ideas with, at one point, just out of the blue, came up to me and said, this contemplative life thing, why don't you go ahead and start that? You can do it full time. and I'll support you. Like, well, that doesn't happen very often. So that was the green light, because one of the things I didn't want to do, I didn't want to do this. In other words, I didn't want to have my personality and wrap a personal brand around it. I wanted to serve it. And so I was kind of waiting patiently for the sign, for the right time. And that was a very good one. And so that was the catalyst event. Now, a couple other points that you had mentioned in that question is that, information practice. One of the things that I've kind of realized as I looked at contemplative life is the kind of three levels of engagement. The first level of engagement is information. People, what is it? What's out there? What is interesting to me? So information. But once you find something that's interesting that you can kind of relate with, then what is it? What is the practice? How do I get formed in it? So from information to formation, training of the practice. But it's not enough to learn about something and even practice it. It's what are the gifts of it? And then so the third dimension is transformation. And transformation comes through the embodiment of the practice for a very long period of time, and most often in community. So information, formation, transformation. But then there's two other sides to it that were, part of the question as well. It's not enough to have personal transformation, is that has to continue into action. So the contemplative life in its most mature form must become the active life, active contemplation or compassionate action. Otherwise, it's not complete. So that's a long answer to a long question.
I think that was very, very insightful. And the way you have put it, it's really poetic and rhyming. Information, formation, and transformation. The three terms are very insightful. And as you have rightly said, there is one level of externality of seeking information, and then making it internalized through some practice. But that should lead to a complete transformation in the individual way of looking at things, the individual perception of things. That means it becomes very much a part of you, and then it gets imbued into your being. So that's what we would look at as what we really call it as transformation. And once you are at that point, you automatically go to spreading the message through what you have called as compassionate action. So in line with that, can you be more specific and tell us about these transformative practices as such? Because I find that as one of the main objectives of you are starting this movement or this organization of contemplative life. What do you think are the main ingredients of transformative practices?
Well, that's a hard question to answer. And the reason is that there are so many different kinds in different contexts, many of which would be better described by a deep practitioner of that particular methodology. So it's hard to have a broad stroke for all of them. But the word contemplative, and the reason why the word contemplative is that part of the root of that is seeing. But seeing what, and it's an inner seeing that through the inner seeing also changes the outer seeing as well. I'm often, asked to try to define that, and I often refrain from trying to describe or define that, because there's a dimension to it that is ineffable, and so it becomes one person's expression of that. And the contemplative experience is just that way. The truth is that nobody can know anybody else's contemplative experience. Not possible. Often we don't even know our own, let alone another, right?
That's absolutely true. But I think you have really touched upon what it exactly means to define the term transformation, where I think you have put it very beautifully by saying that once there is a change in the inner way of seeing things, that would automatically bring a change in your perception of the world around you. So the starting point is within you, and that transformation, the inner transformation, or what I would say as the perception of things in it with a totally different eye, a totally different way of looking at things, and that gets externalized, and you see the world in a totally different, I would say, dimension, which is otherwise not so easily accessible. And you are right in also saying that each one starts at a point, at a different point, because it is something unique to the individual. But yet there is this common ground of change in perception. And coming to the next point, which I wanted you to tell us, is about the 5 observations which you have mentioned in the vision statement of contemplative life. When I was going through your website, I found that to be a very interesting thing, where you have given 5 observations, and you have the very term calling it as observations is also very insightful and interesting, rather than saying something else. When vision statements are given, they are so cliched. But in your case, I found that you have called them as observations, and you have given 5 dimensions to it. And we find that represented in the logo of your organization also, which is that 5-petaled lotus, which we see. Can you please take us through those 5 observations which are there in your vision statement?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And what we're referring to is this. And I don't know if you can see it, I can't make it any larger, but you're very perceptive in noting that this is stated as observations, because that was very intentional. And so let's take the first one. Contemplative experience as a universal human expression is kind of what I've already mentioned. We all have an inner life. And by virtue of that, we all have a contemplative dimension. The moment of silence is a universal practice. And I think that this is worth noting, because practices, they're so diverse. And there's often a challenge with practices, particularly in the secular world, because of the challenge of religion and religious language, and the barriers of allowing that to come in because of everybody has a home team. But the moment of silence, everybody accepts that. And it is really the common, and it is contemplative for sure. And it's amazing, particularly when traumatic events happening in the world, where human beings, their differences dissolve and they enter into this space in communion. So it's universal. All of the world's traditions have contemplative practices. And in fact, most traditions start with some type of revelation. And revelation by itself is a mystery. It comes from another place. And so by virtue of it being mystical, a mystery, it's contemplative. And there's practices around those. So that's, again, something that all the great traditions share in common. And then through these practices, it is through this practice that the transformation occurs, the ripening of the heart, the mind, the body, so that we're able to see beyond our own limited personal perspective and begin to see and experience the mystery in each other and in our world. And contemplative practices, being kind of the common ground, become this network that we can all share together, recognizing that we're all contemplative. And the heart of it is contemplative experiences, very personal, but also something that we all share in common. And this is the lotus that you were referring to, and it was kind of an inspirational idea in terms of practices of the heart, practices of the mind, the body, the spirit, and relational practices. There's lots of different ways that you can approach this, and there's no kind of one way, this way, that way, but that's kind of the one that we landed on.
That's really wonderful way of putting it, and I think it's for us to explore each of these dimensions. But I would like you to throw light on two of the important dimensions, as you rightly said. One is that universally accepted aspect of silence as a practice. So the moment of silence, as you mentioned, I would like you to elaborate on that in terms of what are the dimensions of silence you see, and at what level do we perceive silence, or as the Eastern tradition says, is it actually the absence of all perception from the sensual and mental impressions one accumulates? I would like you to just throw more light on this aspect of moment of silence, as you said, and what are the dimensions of silence you see?
Well, the word silence in some ways is a misnomer, because what we find when we enter silence oftentimes is anything but silence, because our perceptions, our receptivity, our noticing, it becomes refined. And therefore, we're able to hear things we didn't hear before. We're able to feel things we may not have been able to feel. And of course, there's the constant streams of mental thoughts. And so that, again, the question of like dimensions of silence is kind of like, what is practice, what is transformation, what is contemplative? It's going to be different for different people, but so all I can really speak is to my own experience of it. And I know that for me, practice, and I have a daily practice that changes over time, but it involves a lot of silence, both in the morning and evening and periods throughout the day. And my sense is that one is that it's an acquired taste. At first it might be hot and then it becomes sweet later, as the saying goes. And that through practice, it becomes easier and easier to kind of go underneath, or be at in back of the stream of impressions that are flowing in the mind and in the emotions in the body. And the image that I got one time, in terms of my experience of it, it's like being on the beach where there's a bunch of noise and activity, and then diving into the water is like going depth into the silence. And I cease to hear everything that's going on in the beach. It's still happening there, but I'm in a different world. And so it's like that. It's kind of moving down, kind of into the heart or a different part of my human experience where all the things that are going on at the surface are still going on, but I'm meeting life at a deeper level in that moment. I guess that's the best.
The waves are only at the superficial level. Deep down, there is a silence where you can experience, as you said, the stream of all sensual and mental impressions flowing around, and you are undisturbed by it. There's something wonderful. And what really intrigues me is coming to this with your Western background. You born and brought up in a Western culture, which is, you might have seen, because as you said, you lived in so many ashrams and all. So normally what we see is, from the Western viewpoint and the Eastern viewpoint, we started diametrically opposite directions in one way, because the Western way of looking at things is, if somebody is sitting silently or quietly and not doing anything, the first response of the society would be, why are you doing nothing? Why don't you do something? But whereas when it comes to the Eastern perception, it is directly the other way around. And from an Eastern contemplative point of view, we are more inclined to say, why are you always doing something? Why don't you sit quietly doing nothing? The dimensions we approach, maybe we are approaching the same center from two different dimensions. And as you said, it is something personal, and you experience deep down that silence where you allow the whole of stream of consciousness to manifest and expand on its own. That's a very interesting insight. Then I'll come to the second dimension, which we have discussed, is this mystical dimension. As you have rightly said, there is always a mysterious element in every one of us. And in order to come to that revelation, as you mentioned earlier, it is something which one can only know through intuition or meditation, or what is sometimes called as communion. It's essentially going beyond the perceptive, sensual aspect of it, and the cognitive aspect of thinking, interpreting, and judging. So how do you relate this mystic dimension, and where do you think that there is a connect to actually come to that kind of revelation in oneself?
Well, one of the things that's interesting about your observation of the different pathways between the East and the West, which is also, by the way, it's changing some because of technology, and we're being assaulted, and our senses are being bombarded. And we haven't been wired for this. This is a fairly recent phenomena to come from more agrarian base, where working out with the soil and the fields. There's a contemplative dimension to that. And now we're in this digital and electronic environment, and so there's actually a growing recognition, and the pandemic is actually facilitating this as well, is an innate need for pause, for reflection, for silence. So there's a change that's beginning to take place, because there's a sense that we're out of balance here. But the other interesting thing, about, hurry up and, do something, or, hurry up and don't do something, is, the approaches of self versus not self. It's like in the West, people are afraid of dying and not having a self, and in the East, They're, afraid about dying and not having one, or the other way around. And so when you're talking about, how to meet the mystery, this is one of the things that's very interesting. Everybody meets it at different times. And one of the places that we're often confronted with it, like we are now collectively, is in times of crisis, where our norms and our habits are disturbed. So it thrusts us out of our normal patterns. And by virtue of thrusting us out of our normal patterns, it's as if we have to meet the situation or the moment in a different way. So it's almost like it forces the impressions to go down different neurological pathways because we can't rest on the familiar. And so oftentimes what happens is in periods of crisis, people have moments of reflection that it's like, for a small time, the scales fall from their eyes and they realize, oh my God, what am I doing with my life? What am I doing with my time? What is really important? And over and over and over again, people rest on one thing. It's love. It's love. There's nothing more important than that. That's the essence of it. And ultimately, the measure is how much have you loved? How much are you loved? How much love have you given? How much love are you able to receive? And in all its expressions and dimensions, And so practice, community, all these things are a means to an end to somehow come to that place where we can embody the thing that we are really born to realize and fulfill.
I think that's a very wonderful way of putting it. But as you said, being thrown out of one's own comfort zone could be a trigger to come to this mystic dimension of it. When you're really out of your depth and when you really don't know what to do, or you get a moment of revelation where you said, you try to ask these questions of what am I doing with my life and what am I doing with my time and what is it actually I'm looking at, or what is it that I really want. So these questions become very important, and that could be a trigger to connect to the mystic dimension. And you have brought in the wonderful concept of love. How much I have given it out and how much I have actually received in terms of my relation to people, my relation to nature, my relation to the whole environment around me. And maybe that coming to that understanding of what could be a true dimension of love, which may partially reveal the mystery and connect you to something which is much more deeper. I think you have touched upon a very interesting point and very insightful point by bringing it that, I wouldn't really call it as an idea or a concept, but it is deep down a sense of unity, which overflows in the form of love. So that connect, I think maybe, as you rightly said, is the mystic dimension. And if we allow that to happen to us, that would be much more, spontaneous and natural. I think we are already it's close to our time. We have another 5 or 6 minutes to go. Jeff, I would like to ask you one or two questions, especially about your other initiatives, which we have called as transformative 365 and transformation 365 and pro-social world. And in that, when I was going through your website, I found a very interesting thing about altruism. Can you tell us more about these two initiatives of pro-social world and Transformation 365.
Yes. So Transformation 365 was an initiative that was born at the Parliament of World Religions in Toronto. And what it was is a sense by a group of people that met that there's a need to be able to share these transformational practices more widely. And because there's a lot of talking about practice, there's less practicing of practice. And so the thought is that why don't we invite practitioners that have depth to share their practice, where we can record it and then share it widely. That is the practice itself, an experiential practice rather than teaching. And so that is Transformation 365. And every 2 weeks, we release a new video of a practice that we record with a practice leader. And we release it on Facebook Premiere, on Contemplative Life Facebook page. And then we archive it in Transformation 365, in which we have a treasury of them. That there's dozens and dozens of them now that we've assembled and collected. So that's Transformation 365. Pro-social world is something else. I'll try to give you the kind of the slimmed down version of this, but pro-social is something that came through the work of the Nobel Prize winner Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, the first woman in the world that ever won the Nobel Prize. She was a social political scientist, but her and her husband Vincent did field work, and they traveled all over the world, and they met and took copious notes of communities and groups that had no contact with one another, to explore how they were able to avoid something called the tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons is when you have a common pool resource, think agriculture or water, and you have everybody competing for that resource, it tanks the resource, thus the tragedy. But there's groups and communities that were able to avoid this tragedy. And interestingly enough, they were able to avoid it in very common ways. And these common ways she named is the core design principles of pro-social behavior. Then the evolutionary scientist David Sloan Wilson observed Elinor's work and realized, oh my goodness, this is evolutionary. David is a very renowned author and scientist in cultural evolution, and a very hopeful form of evolution, because this is a type of evolution that can happen very quickly, as opposed to genetic evolution, which is a long tail game. And so he began to incorporate evolutionary science into that. And then a psychological scientist looked at this work and said, well, this is also has a contextual behavioral science dimension to it. And then what happened is I came along and I realized that it's practice-based, and there's actually a contemplative dimension to it as well. So what pro-social world is a framework that can be taught to groups of any kind. It's universal, to teach them as a group how to flourish together. And it's able to incorporate other best practices, other change methods. And so it itself is evolving. And prosocial.world is the site, and it's you're going to hear a lot more about it, because this is really something that's profound, something that's time has come, and something that has come out of the collective conscience of humanity. Nobody thought this up. They observed that this is something that human beings have determined works. So that's pro-social world. And then an initiative that we're also launching out of that in the coming year is something called pro-social spirituality, where we're taking the 8 core design principles of pro-social and we're incorporating what's called the 9 elements of universal spirituality. So something that's also kind of come out of the collective that all spiritual traditions embody.
I found that you have used the term altruism in that, and when you were talking about it, I could see that there are 2 dimensions to it. One is competing for the resources, and one is cooperating for the for the common good of all the resources that are available. So it's starting from a different point altogether. And I'm reminded, from my theosophical background, I'm reminded of one of the statements of the founder, H.P. Blavatsky. She always said that this divine wisdom is altruism first and last. And a very beautiful quote which she has given is, you cannot do good to yourself without doing good to others. Today in the contemporary world, even these multi-billionaires and all, they have found that they can't keep all the wealth. They've got to give it out and they have to share it. And then the watchword for the new millennia is cooperation. And I was also very deeply touched by 2 terms which I think you have used. I think deepening the community and healing the fragmentation that is there, which I found very interesting in your website. And finally, coming to one more interesting point which you have mentioned, and I really liked the quote which you have given in connection with the Transformation 365, where you said, when your life becomes your practice becomes your life. That's a wonderful quote. And I think it, in essence, conveys the deeper and inner meaning of all your initiatives. And that's how it should be. I would like to just repeat for this, for the purpose of our participants, this beautiful quote, which says, when your life becomes your practice becomes your life. That's a wonderful way of putting it, Jeff. I think we are coming close to that 1 hour session which we have planned, and I think there is some scope for some taking some points for discussions which the participants may be wanting you to answer. And I already see one by Beenaji herself. She says, is love and compassion a natural progression of a contemplative life? Can it happen outside of contemplation?
Far be it for me to say, because it's something that comes from the mystery itself. And so my sense is that the mystery can happen anywhere, any time. But I also think that it's the natural bouquet, the natural fulfillment of the contemplative life. In fact, that if that's not present, then it's not complete. So if I look at, we look at practices, if we look at this as a tree, and the tree has roots, which are traditions, and the branches are different parts of those traditions. And then you have the fruit of the tree is the qualities that we bring into life. And so you can tell a tree by its fruit.
That's very true. And I think without the dimension of a contemplative life, you cannot touch the ground of silence. And when you mentioned about this tree, I request the participants to go through your website where you have given a beautiful tree, and you have used all your imagination through technology also, where you click on each aspect of it and you get the contemplative practices related to that. I have seen that in your website, a tree with almost about 18 or 20 branches or dimensions to it. And each one, when you click on it, it turns over and gives you the related contemplative practices. And each one can connect to that, to whichever practice appeals to him from his own perspective, whatever practice seems to be most ideal and contextual for him. I think you have provided all that in your website. And it's been a wonderful discussion with you, Jeff. You're coming about, and it's quite early in the morning for you in the US. I can know that, but you have taken time and given us a very what I wouldn't really call it as beautiful, but in the sense a perception coming from your background is something which we need to connect to and make it global. And that opportunity you have provided for all of us. And especially, I would request all the participants to please go through the website, and then you have the opportunity to connect and join any group you like, or multiple groups which may be of interest to you. And that would be a beautiful way of connecting to it. And I think we also see an opportunity to put Rtambhara as a part of the initiatives under the Transformation 365. So we will add that dimension for people to connect to us and know more about this contemplative life, and truly serving the society through the pro-social world. And as you have rightly said, the connecting to communities, deepening your commitment to communities, and healing the fragmentation that we see around us comes from a spiritual dimension. So we can give that initiative to connect to the spiritual dimension, and through that, convert it into social action, which is cooperative and which is mutually beneficial, and generally elevating from a point of view of consciousness. I think that has been truly wonderful. If there are, maybe if you have a couple of minutes time, and if somebody is interested